So here's a question horror fans weren't expecting to ask this soon. What if the director who revived the Evil Dead franchise isn't coming back for the sequel? Because that's exactly what Lee Cronin has just hinted at. The man behind Evil Dead Rise has finally addressed whether he'll return for another Evil Dead movie. And his answer reveals something much bigger happening behind the scenes. Not only was he apparently considering another Evil Dead film, but he also had an entirely different horror project in development before one unexpected movie changed everything. And after looking at what's happening with the franchise right now, there's a good chance Evil Dead is entering its most ambitious era yet. Let's break it down. If you've been following horror over the last few years, you've probably noticed something interesting. A lot of classic horror franchises have struggled to find relevance in the modern era. Some rely too heavily on nostalgia. Some try to reinvent themselves and lose what made them special. But Evil Dead has managed to do something rare. It has evolved without losing its identity. And a huge part of that success comes from Lee Cronin. After directing the 2023 hit Evil Dead Rise, Cronin became one of the most talked about names in modern horror. Now fans want to know one thing. Will he return for Evil Dead Rise 2? His latest comments finally give us an answer. And it's not as straightforward as you might think. In a recent interview, Cronin spoke openly about his future with the Evil Dead franchise. Instead of teasing another sequel, he took a surprisingly respectful approach. He basically said that questions about the future of Evil Dead should be answered by Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and producer Rob Tappert. And honestly, that makes sense. Those three are the architects of the franchise. Cronin described himself as someone who was lucky enough to be a steward of the series for a period of time. That's an interesting choice of words. Not owner, not future leader. Steward. Someone who temporarily guides something before passing it on. That alone tells us a lot about how he views his role in the franchise. But here's the key detail. He didn't rule out returning. He simply said he's happy the universe is continuing and that he's excited to see where it goes next. That's very different from saying he's done forever. It sounds more like someone who's currently focused on another chapter of his career. And that chapter has a name. The Mummy Point, one of the most surprising revelations from Cronin's interview, is that he was actually considering multiple projects before committing to The Mummy. One of those projects? An Evil Dead sequel. Another was reportedly a paranormal investigation story based on a real case from Ireland during the 1980s. That sounds exactly like the type of grounded, supernatural horror that Cronin excels at. But neither project happened. Instead, The Mummy took over. Cronin described it as one of those ideas that gets under your skin and becomes impossible to ignore. That's something directors often say when they find a project they genuinely connect with. And in Hollywood, timing matters. Sometimes the opportunity is there. Sometimes it isn't. In this case, The Mummy arrived at exactly the right moment. The film released earlier this year and crossed the $90 million mark worldwide. For a horror movie with a relatively controlled budget, that's a solid result. More importantly, it proves Cronin can handle major horror properties beyond Evil Dead. And that's where things become interesting. Because studios love directors who can successfully revive franchises that understand why fans want Cronin back so badly. We need to look at what he accomplished. Before Evil Dead Rise, the franchise was in a strange position. The 2013 reboot, directed by Fede Alvarez, was successful and earned nearly $100 million worldwide. Critics liked it. Fans liked it. But then nothing happened for almost a decade. 10 years is a long time in Hollywood. Franchises usually either move forward or disappear. Then Evil Dead Rise arrived. Instead of repeating the cabin in the woods formula, Cronin moved the horror into a cramped apartment building. That sounds like a small change, but it completely altered the feeling of the movie. The result? The highest-grossing Evil Dead film ever made. The movie earned roughly $147 million worldwide and became the franchise's biggest box office success. That's not easy to do when you're competing against 40 years of nostalgia. What Cronin proved is that Evil Dead doesn't need to be trapped by its own history. It can evolve. And that's probably why the franchise is expanding right now. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. A lot of fans are waiting for Evil Dead Rise 2. But the franchise isn't waiting around. There are already multiple projects moving forward. The next film, Evil Dead Burn, is scheduled for release in July 2026. Early details suggest a family reunion that descends into Deadite chaos, continuing the franchise's tradition of turning ordinary situations into nightmares. And after that comes Evil Dead Wrath, which is currently set for release in 2028 and has already wrapped production. What's fascinating is that Lee Cronin is still involved behind the scenes as an executive producer. That means even if he's not directing, his influence remains part of the franchise's future. So the situation isn't really Cronin leaves Evil Dead. It's more accurate to say that he's stepping back from the director's chair while helping guide the franchise from another position. And honestly, that might be the healthiest approach. At first glance, some fans might see this as disappointing. After all, Evil Dead Rise was a major success. Why wouldn't you immediately make another one? But horror history tells us something important. The best horror franchises survive because different filmmakers bring different ideas. Think about it. Sam Raimi created Evil Dead. Fede Alvarez reinvented it. Lee Cronin expanded it. Now new filmmakers are adding their own perspectives. That constant evolution is one reason the franchise has lasted for more than 4 decades. If the same creative formula gets repeated forever, eventually audiences stop caring. Fresh voices keep horror alive. And Evil Dead seems to understand that better than most franchises. That there's another angle here that deserves attention. Lee Cronin's career trajectory. A few years ago, most people only knew him from a smaller horror film called The Hole in the Ground. Then he directed Evil Dead Rise. Now he's directing The Mummy. That's a massive jump. What we're watching in real time is the rise of a filmmaker becoming one of horror's most trusted directors. And history suggests this usually leads somewhere bigger. Look at what happened with Sam Raimi. Look at James Wan. Look at Fede Alvarez. Successful horror directors often become franchise builders, which means Cronin's future may involve creating entirely new horror worlds instead of staying in just one. That's probably why he sounded so calm about not directing another Evil Dead movie right now. He knows opportunities are opening up. The short answer? Absolutely. Nothing in Cronin's comments suggests the door is closed. In fact, it sounds like the opposite. He was apparently close enough to the idea that a sequel was being seriously considered before The Mummy changed his plans. Hollywood is full of projects that get delayed rather than canceled. Schedules change. Studios change priorities. Directors finish other commitments. Then projects come back around. So if Evil Dead Burn performs well and Evil Dead Wrath continues the franchise's momentum, there is every reason to believe another chapter connected to Evil Dead Rise could eventually happen. The only question is whether Cronin will be available when that opportunity arrives. Right now, the biggest takeaway isn't that Lee Cronin is leaving Evil Dead. It's that Evil Dead has become strong enough to continue growing beyond a single director. That's exactly what fans should want. The franchise is expanding. New movies are coming. Cronin remains involved behind the scenes. And the possibility of an Evil Dead Rise sequel is still alive. Meanwhile, Cronin is exploring new territory with The Mummy and potentially other horror projects in the future. So while Evil Dead Rise may not be happening immediately, the future of the franchise looks stronger than it has in decades. And honestly, that's a pretty good position for horror fans to be in. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe because we'll be covering all the latest updates on Evil Dead Burn, Evil Dead Wrath, and the future of horror's biggest franchises. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.